This is going to be one of the hottest places in the world due to climate change. It already is super hot with the monsoon cycle and everything else. Doesn't that mean air conditioning units are probably going to be wanted hand over fist? There's a billion. They all want to stay cooler. Whoever corners that market, and it's probably going to be the Japanese, are going to make a lot of money.
Geopolitical expert Jacob Shapiro joins us this week. He's a partner at Cognitive Investments. And today we'll cover investment opportunities in India, Japan, and Argentina. And Jacob will explain to us why he's pessimistic about the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. I'm Ed D'Agostino, and this is Global Macro Update. There's so much terrible stuff going on. U.S. relationship with China, Taiwan, it just never ends. I want to talk about something positive with you. It's something going in what I think is the right direction. The more work I do on this, the more convinced I am that this might be the biggest investment opportunity of the decade. And I'm talking about India. Now, this is where you fall over laughing.
Everything that's happened in the last couple of years, I don't laugh at anything anymore. It's a way to get in trouble.
The only reason I say that is because I was telling someone about this, my kind of the work that I've been doing on India and investing in and around India, and their comment was, yeah, that's the old joke. India's been 10 years away from world dominance for the last 100 years. I think that was how he put it, right? So I get all the criticism, but on paper, India is just amazing. I mean, you've got a country with 1.4 billion people, and half of them are under 30. What other nation has that kind of demographic profile? And yet they're digitizing their economy. Cell phone rate of adoption is through the roof. E-commerce is skyrocketing. They're completely leapfrogging technologies that we went through. You know, they're in a 5-year span, they're seeing what took us 50 years to do in this country. I'm really curious, just your global overview. How do you feel about India right now, geopolitically?
A couple of things first. First is there's tons of bad things happening. There's tons of great things happening in the world too. If anybody cares to scratch beyond, front page or whatever else is happening on the front page. It's also, I feel like India is in this class of countries that has all the potential in the world, but hasn't realized them. I don't think de Gaulle actually said it in the end, but de Gaulle was reported to have said of Brazil, it's the country of the future and it always will be. I feel like all these countries have their little mottos that go with them. As far as India goes, I'm ambivalent, to tell you the truth. When I do presentations and I have my multipolar map of the world and I divide the world into different blocks and different spheres, I usually throw India into a grab bag of powers that I can't make up my mind about. I can't figure out if India is about to take over the entire world or is about to collapse in on itself. You are right that nobody has both the demographic numbers that India has. And as my business partner, Rob Larity, likes to say, quantity is a quality all of its own. All the warts that I might point out about India, 1.4 billion, check. That's almost checkmate automatically. I will say, though, that there are countries like Brazil, like Indonesia, more so Indonesia if we're talking about exact demographic profiles, where the profiles are similar. Yeah, maybe it's only 300 million or 400 million people, but maybe the problems aren't as stark. And I would really start with two problems with India to problematize your optimism, because the optimistic take is there, and it's in some ways obvious. The first is, yes, there's 1.4 billion people. They are incredibly poor. The GDP per capita of India is sort of in the same ballpark as Hades. So, we're talking about an extremely poor country and a country that has been extremely poor for a long time. So, China was very poor once upon a time too. Some parts of China are still very poor. But if you're thinking about, maybe India could be the next China, that's room for growth, Jacob. That's not a problem. The second problem with India, though, is, China, South Korea, Japan, these Asian tigers that were able to modernize and industrialize very, very quickly. They all did it within the context of globalization. And number one, globalization is starting to fade as a force. And number two, India's self-stated strategic goal is not to be part of globalization, is not to be the next China. Narendra Modi's goals since the very beginning have been self-reliance. and India being self-reliant on itself. They're talking about building their own semiconductor industry, all these other sorts of things. And what made China and all those other Asian tigers rise was a combination of ruthless application of the rule of law and real efficiency on the part of governments to disperse this technology and things like that. For better and for worse, India doesn't have that. India is a democracy of 1 billion plus people. It has one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, even though it's a minority population. They speak 50 plus different languages. Until Modi, there were multiple different, no matter what region that you went into. Now he's harmonized some of that. But you sort of put all of that together, and if it's going to be India, it's not going to look the way that those other Asian tigers did. It's going to have to be more piecemeal. When I approach India from an investment perspective, I usually advise stay away from the indices, because I don't think India as a whole is going to go in one direction or another. I think there are parts of the Indian economy, whether it's e-commerce or some of these other things. You're absolutely right. It's a gold mine. It's 1.4 billion people waiting to happen. There are other parts of the economy that look like a complete and total disaster. And no matter, even with Modi and all his popularity, the things he's done to make things easier, it's just not working. Just look at the farmer protests and how they seem to arrest every single agricultural reform he's tried to input. So I think that one of the reasons I think India doesn't get as much play in global media is it's a complicated story. You can't just put on the front page, India terrible or India great. It's like India is all of these things. It's that big. So I'm with you and I'm against you at the same time. How's that for a non-answer?
No, I think that's fair. It's not a monolithic country. There's a lot of complexity and nuance there. A couple of things that I think maybe they got right, though. They're not heavily dependent on imports or exports. And so they're kind of dodging this bullet right now of the unwinding of globalization. So that may have been well played on Modi's part. Modi is, by all counts, one of, if not the most popular politicians in the world, which is amazing in and of itself. And I think when I think about the multipolar world that we live in, I sort of put India in the middle. Like they're the man in the middle. They're going to be able to play with both East and West. One of the few large countries that I think is going to be able to play both sides reasonably successfully and stay neutral. And I think, again, I think those are huge opportunities for the country.
Yeah.
They're investing in infrastructure. So they're focused on internal growth of GDP.
I mean, they have a lot of infrastructure they need to invest in because of their geography. I mean, they are dependent on energy imports. So energy is going to be a real problem spot for them. And they say that they're building out all this renewable capacity and everything else. Like that's going to be their Achilles heel. And I do think, by the way, at the macro perspective, watching the Middle East transition from being the top supplier for the United States and European markets to now being the supplier for India and China, like watching that shift happen in real time is in some ways the most underreported macroeconomic shift, geopolitical shift that is happening, full stop. And it necessitates that India is going to be a more powerful country because they're going to have to deploy their navy to secure access to energy. Their agricultural complex is also very interesting. People have been talking in the same way that they've been talking about China, that India is not going to be able to grow enough food for itself. But India, in this sense, is really exposed to climate change because it's all about the monsoon cycle. So they'll have a couple years where they are not only self-sufficient, they are exporting and pressuring prices for U.S. farmers and everybody else. Then they'll have a couple years, and they're in one of their downward phases right now where they're desperate for food imports. And if they don't get their hands on food imports, you're going to see rising food prices and even hunger and starvation and things like that. And in terms of industry, you're right, they're a middleman. So when, for instance, China and India start squabbling over their conflicted border agreements and either India or China decides to shut down the border for a couple of weeks, all those intermediate goods supply chains shut down. And then all of your US tech companies, which all depend on little gizmos and gadgets and switches and things like that cross these borders, start to freak out because they realize how integrated all of this trade is. And in terms of why they're not competitive on exports or why they're not as dependent on exports as, say, China, that's because they aren't as competitive as China. They never have been with all the red tape and everything else that you're throwing in. I also think that, your you're positing them as the middleman, and you're right. They have a history of non-alignment, but this is going to be a very difficult needle for Modi to thread because he has sort of burnished relations with the United States. Indian-U.S. relations are arguably better than they've ever been in history. And India-Chinese relations are not particularly good right now. They still haven't figured out their problems. So maybe India can play that role, but I think of countries like Turkey and of Indonesia and of Brazil actually playing that role a little bit better, in part because they're smaller. Like Modi, in some ways, is playing for India not as a middleman for anyone, but as its own thing. That it's going to have a seat at the adult table. And maybe it will, maybe it won't. But I do. The ironic thing is, the more successful India is, the less it's going to be able to play all those different sides. The more it's probably either going to be forced into choosing her side or building a side all of its own. And I don't know if you've read. I can't remember if it's Ghost Fleet or 2032. They're both novels about what the next major world war would look like. And as a rejoinder to everything I just said, I think it's 2032, but I'd have to go back and look. I don't want to spoil the plot because your listeners should go read those books. But India does exactly what you're talking about. They play the sort of on the outskirts, the middleman role, everything else. China and the United States and Russia and Iran, everybody's killing each other. And India is the one sort of behind the scenes actually pushing all the buttons. So plenty of smart people agree with your take there.
You know, you brought up oil, and I think there's a really important point to make, and I wish I was smart enough to have thought of this myself, but Charles Gove, who was one of the founders of GovCow Research and just a legend, an investing and research legend in our industry. I saw an interview with him. I'll put a link in the description and I'll send it to you. He talked about how one of the big stories for India right now is that they're now able to buy oil using rupees, using their own currency. And that is a game changer. They're not able to buy all their oil using rupees, but they're able to buy a lot, primarily trading with Russia. So now Russia's sitting there with all these rupees because they don't necessarily want dollars. But the challenge is, and Charles's brilliant point was, India's managed to shift the currency exchange risk from themselves as the buyers over to the sellers of oil. And if they want to take the next step of modernization, they're going to have to modernize their bond market. But if they can do that, and if they can make their bonds more liquid, that will in turn make them much more attractive to foreign investors and could potentially drive down interest rates, which are currently around 7%. And if they can get interest rates down to 4 or 5%, that in and of itself is a huge tailwind for the Indian economy. What do you think of that? Because I had not heard that yet.
Yeah, I mean, again, it goes to this broader shift where, and I don't think it's just going to be about Russia. I mean, they can sort of force Russia into accepting rupees right now. But if you go back in history, like hundreds of years, and you go look back at the history of reserve currencies and things like that, India was actually a huge economic influence in the Middle East and in East Africa. And the old rupee was actually one of the dominant currencies in those parts of the world. So there's good history to say that the Indian rupee and India's sort of economic center of gravity can extend beyond the subcontinent, can get into the Middle East and can get into East Africa. Now, that sort of raises the whole, they have Pakistan on their border. They're always squabbling with Pakistan. There's Hindu versus Muslim. Modi is very Hindu nationalist. All of the efficiencies that he's been able to push through in part is because he's doubling down on Hindu nationalism. How does that make the Muslim population feel? So far, he's been able to deal with that relatively well, but that's sort of your negative base case. But look, sign me up, but I'll wait for the Indians to reform their bond system before I start going after it. Because it's one of those ifs. Like India, the answer for so many of India's problems has long been on paper. Like it's not a mystery. It's just been their inability to actually push it through. And that for me has been the most disappointing part of the Modi government. He had grand plans for all the things he was going to do to modernize, and he's done some of them, like the GST tax reform. He really did try with the farmers. He didn't fail so much. Demonetization, like he has some feathers in his cap. But broadly speaking, and maybe he'll be able to push through more in his last term, which I think it'll probably be, or I don't know, I shouldn't say that, but in his next term, maybe he'll be able to push through more. But thus far, Like he has not lived up to his promise, and there's not going to be an Indian leader who's as popular as he is. So if he can't do it, like it's probably not going to happen. So I'm with you. When they show me that they can reform the bond market, like great, I will be right there with you in the second row. I'll let some other guys go first.
When we were kind of going back and forth here, in a debate format, but I'm actually with you too. I'm not all in on all things India when it comes to being a foreign investor. But one area, after looking at the demographics and the growth trends, one area that I became intrigued by, you mentioned, right? Like e-commerce, the digital economy. I think that digital communications, digital economy, I think there's a massive opportunity there. And that led me to a guy named Kevin Parker, who launched an ETF. The ticker's INQQ. Not endorsing it or recommending it, but it's worth looking at. It is basically an ETF of Indian digital commerce companies. So it's a narrow sliver of the overall economy, and it's the sliver that I think is probably going to be the outperformer. It's expensive by some measures, but when you factor in growth, it maybe isn't that expensive. It's really interesting to think about what India has been able to do digitally. I had a conversation with Kevin, and he educated me on the India stack. 20 years ago, not even 20 years ago, they went from no one having a government ID number of any sort, and most people not knowing when they were born because there's no birth certificates, right? Right? Like they went from that to the equivalent of a social security number linked to your biometrics on a national database in the blink of an eye. And you think about all the things that you can do with that in terms of a payment system, and they're doing all those things. That's kind of what I think is really remarkable about India.
And in your example, like you almost want nothing to do with the Indian government at that point. You want companies or verticals where they are taking advantage of this massive market and not having to rely on reforms or this, that, the other thing. INQQ sounds great. I have for a long time been enchanted by this is sort of a keep it simple, stupid idea, but this is going to be one of the hottest places in the world due to climate change. It already is super hot with the monsoon cycle and everything else. These are lots of, when Modi came to office, he was talking about making sure everybody had indoor plumbing and toilets. That was a real campaign promise when he first started. Doesn't that mean air conditioning units are probably going to be wanted hand over fist for 1 billion plus people? I mean, there are those types of very, very simple, like they're not going to make you feel like you're the smartest macro investor in the room, because it's really just, hey, there's 1 billion. They all want to stay cooler. Whoever corners that market, and it's probably going to be the Japanese, like are going to make a lot of money. So there's lots of, I think you're exactly right. I like the slivers of India. I don't want the whole cake. Somebody else can have the whole cake, but give me the slivers with the extra icing or the extra parts that are particularly interesting to me.
If you had to rank India as a potential investor on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the best, how do you feel about India right now?
Again, if it's just India as a whole, 5. I'm completely coin toss. I'm completely in the middle and completely not going to make a call, and I'm going to create all kinds of fancy ways not to answer your question. But if you're talking about, I want to be exposed to the digital economy in India, specifically e-commerce, great. I'm a 9 or a 10. You want to get into, things like air conditioning or consumer goods or things like that in India, great. I'm a 10. You want to talk to me about energy transition and things like that, or even IT services where they've already become the most competitive in the world. Okay, great. Like I'm up there with you. So yeah, I would reject any investment choice that forces me to be one thing or another about the entire country. No, I'm not in. But if you can get more targeted exposure, yes, then absolutely, it's a compelling move.
I feel the same way. If you're a foreign investor, you need to think about at what stage of the country's development are you investing, and how badly do they need your money? Like how safe is your investment going to be over the long term in that nation, right? And I look at China now, and for me personally, the risk reward ratio is way out of whack. I am not comfortable deploying capital directly into a company listed on a Chinese exchange. I just feel like there's too much risk. And their stock market is beaten up and they don't necessarily need our money. But you look at India, I think they are going to need foreign direct investment and foreign investors to fund their growth, at least for the next decade. That's the last plug I'll say for people curious, but you should do your own due diligence for sure.
You should. And so much of this is timing. I mean, the other thing about, we're talking about the grand macro stuff, which is the fun stuff. Indian markets have been quite elevated for some time. And like Chinese equities are priced. I had a chart in just a deck I gave the other day where like the Hang Seng is sort of at the level that it was when the Spice Girls put out their first album. So if you like the Spice Girls, like they're back. But that's because the risk is there and people have, like you're going to get compensated for your risk if things go in a different direction. And if all of these market related reforms that Xi is trying to push through, and if his quest to get Chinese citizens to buy stocks rather than real estate property in ghost cities works, like maybe there could be some, but I agree with you. There's a lot of risk to be compensated for there. The funny thing is, if you look at, and it's very hard to get access to this market, the only ETF I know of that services, U.S. investors that gets you access to Pakistan has like a ridiculously low level of liquidity. But Pakistan, you're ticking the bottom of the cycle there. So like if you're looking for bargains and looking for timing and countries that have some of that profile or are next to it and could profit from some of it, but have not been sort of saluted as the darling of democracy and the future of blah, blah, blah. Like there are some interesting things around the edges to also play that might be better from a timing point of view. Because right now, you've probably seen the chart. Indian equities are priced like India is the country of the future, and probably will get some more shocks and some better opportunities to engage. So
I want to circle back on one thing you brought up too, when you were talking about air conditioners, and you thought Japan might be the country to win that battle. How do you feel about Japan? Just their stock market just returned to an all-time high, or returned to where it was before the crash decades ago. Lot of optimism. There's rumors that they might start to move away from zero interest rates, but the market seems to be hanging in there. There's a lot to look at in Japan right now. I asked my analyst, go find me a list of Japanese companies in Japan that have a lot of exposure to the defense industry. Because I think Japan's going to remilitarize, and it's just starting. It's a defense play. Let's see how to get involved. And he came back and was like, "This is the hardest request you've ever given me."
Yeah, well, again, this has to do with timing. Like 2 years ago, and by the way, first of all, congratulations to all the bag holders who bought Japanese equities in the 1980s. You have finally round-tripped and recouped your value if you've been around for this long. Also, the rumors about interest rates, there's a reason they call, the yen the widowmaker trade. Rumors have been there forever. But I will say, 2 years ago now, we loved Japan. And we're loading up on Japan in some of our strategies and for some of our clients and things like that. And then Warren Buffett discovered Japan, and now everybody's discovered Japan, and now we're at all-time highs. So part of me is frustrated with that. Look, Japan on paper, if India on paper is a giant, Japan makes no sense as a geopolitical power, let alone as an economy. They have to import all of their energy. People talk about Chinese demographics. Japanese demographics are absolutely terrible. If demographics were really predictive, the way the out there say they are, Japan shouldn't be anything, let alone a sort of rising power and a good investment. The thing about Japan is they combine a really unified and efficient government, and in some ways their needs discipline them. It says, okay, we don't have all this energy, so we have to be the first to figure out LNG and import LNG. Oh, everybody else has figured out LNG? Okay, we've got to go be the best at hydrogen or the best at nuclear. Like, in some sense, their shortcomings cause them to go all in on the things that they need. Defense industrial investments are always tricky because, again, you're sort of playing with the government and budgets, and Japanese politics ever since Abe's death have been a little all over the place. I think Japan is also it's an interesting way to also play China without having to play China, because as much as Japanese companies don't like this, many Japanese companies are dependent on the Chinese market. And what Japan is doing is they're not decoupling from China. They know that's impossible. They're building a supply chain for China and a supply chain for everywhere else in the world. So Japanese companies, like, they're not going to leave China in any meaningful way, but they're looking to places like India, like Bangladesh, like Indonesia, like Malaysia, where they're trying to build out new supply chains, and even maybe import labor. That would sort of be the next step, which, very halting signs that they've been trying to relax some of their controls about sin. I also usually point out when it comes to Japan, everybody talks about China's Belt and Road Initiative and how it's evidence that China's taking over the world. Japan has invested more in regional infrastructure than China has via the Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, Japan is really the sleeping giant that is actually thinking about productive investments in factories and all these other things. So I think we are reaching a point in Japanese history where the old world is going away and Japan is trying to flip the switch and say, okay, if we're going to stay relevant, we have to make a lot of changes and we have to make them in very, very quick succession. And there are very, very few countries in the world that have demonstrated an ability to do that. And I think they're right at that cusp. So for a lot of different reasons, I think Japan is it's an unorthodox play. And maybe right now there's a little too much froth around it. But when in terms of expertise, in terms of human capital, in terms of sort of the imperatives to do something, and in terms of how they've managed to do these moments, it has all of those things in its favor.
All the reading that I've done indicates that they are aware they need to invest more in their military, in self-defense. They live in a dangerous neighborhood. But there's almost this, well, there's not almost, there's a cultural sort of aversion to defense. So some of the Kawasaki's and Mitsubishi's and the big heavy industry players in that country sort of veil their work in that space and don't really like to talk about it. It's definitely not something that they want to be. They're not proud of it, which I find interesting. You'd think that the public would have some awareness that they maybe need to spend a little bit more on defense.
Again, that's also how things are phrased. So, I mean, Germany has the same cultural problem for some similar issues, but Japan is spending and modernizing much more militarily than Germany is. Like Germany, the rot is sort of deep-seated within the military itself, whereas Japan, Shinzo Abe wanted to change the constitution. That's probably not going to happen. There's too much political backlash for that. But Japanese defense budgets keep on getting bigger and bigger, and Japan actually has invested quite a bit. And Japan's Navy, I mean, in terms of just, capabilities and experience and things like that, right there, if not better than the Chinese Navy, certainly has more experience. I often joke, China's not even the best Navy in its own backyard because Japan can lay claim to that, at least from, in terms of some of the operations that they're able to do. So there is a cultural hesitancy to get rid of, the ban on offensive weaponry or on offensive military actions and things like that. But I think there has been enough of a cultural shift around, but we also have to protect our interests in Japan. And you're seeing that translate into real investments in a way that we have not seen that yet with Germany. Germany talks the talk, but does not walk the walk. Japan is moving in that direction and has been for years.
I've been resisting the urge to ask you about the more front page conflicts, because I think it's fun to give some of these other issues and areas some attention once in a while. Mm-hmm. But I think my producer would appreciate it if I would at least give a nod to the other things that are going on in the world without diving deep into all the big crises that the world is facing. Like what's got your attention right now? What are you intrigued by? And do you have any predictions on how some of the bigger conflicts in the world might get resolved?
Well, I mean, what I'm intrigued by is exactly what we're talking about. Like, I'm intrigued about whether, Morena is going to win a supermajority in Mexico and what that means for the future of U.S.-Mexico relations. I'm interested in Brazil and whether they're finally going to carry tax reform across the finish line and turn Brazil from, perpetual underachiever into rising giant. I am fascinated by this Milei guy in Argentina. The jokes make themselves. But in terms of, the big picture stuff, I will say I had sort of checked off, or I had erased the regional conflagration scenario for the Middle East war off of my score sheet. I sort of thought, okay, like it's going to be an Israeli-Palestinian affair. The Houthis are going to do some things. Like, yes, that has sort of long-term implications for shipping, and the United States is a dominant power. But, nobody, no state actor seems to want a broader conflict. I sat up in my chair last week when the White House leaked, I think it was to CNN, that they were worried about the Israelis going into Lebanon and going after Hezbollah. I was worried about that in October. I thought it was maybe they were going to talk Gaza, but it was really let's hit the real threat in Hezbollah sort of thing. I thought it was off the table. Now it seems like whether it's because of domestic Israeli politics, whether it's because Netanyahu knows that the longer the war goes on, the longer he gets to remain. Sorry to be so cynical, but I don't know how else to say it. You start putting all those things together. Like I'm a little bit more in my chair about Israel and Lebanon and Hezbollah and Iran and how that would all work out. So that's one. And as for Russia and Ukraine, it's the West has gotten tired of it. And I think this is what Putin was hoping for. He was hoping Russia was going to outsuffer the West. And he's beginning to get some returns on that investment as well. I'll say to you what I said to somebody who asked me last week about whether the United States was going to continue to support Ukraine. Ultimately, I don't know whether, if Biden wins, we'll support Ukraine for another 4 years. I don't know when the support will end, but it will end eventually. And whether Ukraine is going to maintain any semblance of sovereignty or independence is going to come entirely down to the Europeans. The Europeans either have to put on their big boy pants and decide we're going to help Ukraine defend itself, or if they give up, like it'll be some kind of weird rump state, and Russia will slowly consume sliver after sliver until they get to the end. That's why it was so interesting to see Macron. I forget if it was a week ago or 2 weeks ago, even raised the notion that maybe there was an option for deployment of NATO troops on the ground. And the way he got shouted down from Germany and everyone else, he's not saying deploy, but if you're not even willing to have the threat of deployment in the back of Vladimir Putin's mind, like you're basically just telling him, okay, like we're getting tired of it. And you've probably seen the statistic too, that the North Koreans have sent more ammunition, artillery ammunition to Russia over something like the last 12 months than the Europeans have. Like that's not going to work. Like, so those are the big picture conflicts. And as you can tell, I'm pessimistic about both of them in some way.
Let's end it on a good note. What is no one talking about that has you really excited?
Man, besides Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift? No,
Besides that.
Okay. There's a lot of interesting things happening around the world, but I really do think Argentina is an interesting place to keep focused. Now, I'm not saying that Milei is going to be able to turn it around, and he's got a long road to hoe. But part of me wonders is Brazil had a moment like this around 94, 95, where they had, hyperinflation, and they had, they really had to reset things, and they had to think very clearly about structural reforms. And it took them until about now to get to the point where all of that was starting to pay off. I wonder if Argentina is at the very, very beginning moments of that, whether we finally ticked bottom and that Milei is a signal that people want real change there. And it's interesting because from a geopolitical perspective, Argentina has everything you possibly could want. It's the entrance to the Rio de la Plata, really doesn't have any rivals around it that are going to threaten it. It can play all sides, ample, resources that it can export. They have their own version of the shale revolution happening. So they're going to add hydrocarbons to the list. I mean, if you could but people have been saying this about Argentina for 100 years too, but if you could just get them to change their culture, and maybe it takes a guy who, communes with his dead dog to get election strategy to be the man to push it forward. But that might be, as we're looking back at 2023 and 2024, I wonder if we'll say that was the year that Argentina finally started to change. It's a very interesting political experiment that's happening.
I hope you're right. Jacob Shapiro, always good to see you, my friend. Thank you for taking some time.
Always. Cheers.